and welcome to another episode of Smart Talk. One of the things we bang on about on this show is US imperialism. Not Chinese or Russian imperialism, but US imperialism. Why? Because it's the main imperialist force causing havoc around the world, but also because for all their sins, we do not think Russia or China themselves constitute imperialist powers. This theme is one of the things that keeps the small and marginal left even more divided. Many groups today characterize the world situation as one of inter-imperialist rivalries. We do not. And this is not a mere academic or analytical difference, but it has some serious implications for what you push for out there in the real world when things happen. So, as the US continues its offensive, we thought it was important to insist on this point of analysis as a means of insisting that the left has to get its house in order and understand why the entire framework of inter-imperialist rivalries is false. So this is the theme of our discussion today, and to lay all this out, I am joined once again by Comrade Perrault. Hello.
Hello, Mansa.
Hi. So, look, we actually submitted this. It's an article, a small article called The Fallacy? The Fallacy of the Inter-Imperialist Analysis. This is our submission for the meeting of internationalist forces, which is a meeting that's going to take place in Paris in a couple of months. It's a gathering of the left. And as far as I understand, a lot of that left has this view that Russia and China are imperialist and we are in an inter-imperialist situation. So I guess maybe just lay out why is this our submission?
Yeah, well, I think as you said in your intro, this is really one of the big questions dividing the left. And this particular group, selection of groups that will be at this event, really the overwhelming position there is that we're an inter-imperialist world and that China's imperialist, Russia's imperialist. Honestly, that's one of the only points on which there's almost unanimous agreement among all those groups, whereas, they're divided on everything else.
Yeah. I wonder maybe if you wouldn't mind, look, we're going to talk about imperialist, inter-imperialist, whatever, anti-imperialist. Maybe let's just get some basics down.
Yeah.
In terms of definitions, because this is, of course, the left is divided over it today, but it really is one of the things that plagues the left, basically, historically.
Yeah.
Is going as far back as Lenin. Like, what is imperialist? There's very liberal definitions that any time a country does something bad, it becomes imperialist. Some people call Iran imperialist. Some people call India imperialist. So, let's just get some basic definitions down so our listeners can have a bit of a compass. What is it? What is imperialist?
Well, our modern imperialism, because there's been imperialism, since the rise of the first empires, slave empires and, different mercantile empires. So when we talk about imperialism today, we talk about a stage of capitalism. And honestly, our definition is not different from that of Lenin. It's the one that he lays out in his famous book, Imperialism, Highest Stage of Capitalism. So it's a stage, and he defines basic criterias, for this stage. The world has been divided, the export of finance capital, and so on. But I think what people miss today is that I think there's two things that are missed. I think the first thing that's missed is what was Lenin's political purpose in elaborating this definition? It really was to fight against pacifists. Tendencies within the workers' movement, specifically Kautsky, who tried to present, imperialism as a wrong policy. And so his arguments were really against that. But I think a lot on the left have drawn a really wrong lesson from that, and are now presenting imperialism as just purely an economic thing. Mm-hmm. Purely the export of finance capital. Mm-hmm. And so if you view it like that, then really any country can be imperialist, more or less, in the world. Mm-hmm. So that's why Iran, because it exports, I don't know, a few thousand, a few billion somewhere, suddenly it's capitalist, or because it attacks one other country somewhere, it's imperialist. So I think it's this kind of, it's ironically kind of using Lenin's definition to inject kind of pacifist notions in today's world. And this brings me to the second big mistake that people make is to kind of just hang on to these abstract concepts. What is imperialism? What is non-imperialist? Which country is imperialist? Which country is non-imperialist? And really not looking at the concrete development of world politics. as they actually manifest themselves. So when Lenin wrote his book, it was at the start of World War I, and the world was very clearly divided between a group of competing empires. There was the long-established British Empire, the French Empire, and then there was rising imperialist powers like Japan and the United States and Germany, who were kind of fighting for their spot. And so people just hold on to Lenin's kind of framework of competing imperialist powers and kind of forget actually what's actually happened since that time. And after the First World War, you had the Second World War, where basically all of the imperialists, the main rivals, rising imperialist powers, Japan and Germany, were smashed in that war. And the old traditional imperialist powers were left really weakened. And the US really emerged as the dominant imperialist power on the whole world. And facing the US was not a rival imperialist power, but the Soviet Union, which was a worker state. So that was just a fundamentally different context from the one Lenin was writing about. That's not a theory, did not change, but the context is very different. And then if we jump ahead to the post-Soviet period, where you get the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then what you see happening again is really the US empire really covering the whole globe. Now, I've just said a lot, probably more than you wanted on answering this to answer your question.
No, it's good. Well, let me just follow up on a couple of things. One is why, look, because what you're saying, we've been saying for some time. Every time we insist on this point, going back to 2023, where we had our sort of conference and, characterized the post-Soviet period as one defined by U.S. hegemony and the current epoch as one of breakdown of U.S. hegemony, blah, blah, blah. But I guess those points don't land on the left so easily. Why is it important to view things view imperialism as something in its development, I guess? Why is it not enough to just look at the definition and then see what fits the definition? I'm trying to get to, how should you actually carry out analysis?
But there's two questions, The second question is basically, that's Marxism, right? Marxism, it doesn't take abstract truth, but kind of look at each thing in its concrete development and its inner contradictions. So that's the answer to that thing. Then why is there so much confusion on this question? Well, having the correct theory is not sufficient to convince people. You have to, events have to kind of impose themselves on reality. And the truth is that with the US being kind of hegemonic for all this time, it's made a lot of people just kind of forget some of the basics about imperialism. And also the system for so many years functioned without it being really clear, how much US power was really at the center of it. If you look at the 2000s or something, it looks like the whole system, the world economic system, basically just works mainly through economic relations, There was the US... Huh?
Globalization.
Yeah, exactly. So there was the U.S. war in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on, but that wasn't really central to the big economic questions that were happening during that period. So you kind of have this illusion that, well, imperialism is just this nebulous thing, that Indian billionaires putting their money in London, that's India's imperialists. So you kind of lose the reality that this whole system is supported and founded on the American army and the US's victory in World War II. Yeah. Of course, now a lot of people are kind of waking up to this as, that system is starting to crumble. And as the US really shows what imperialism really is about by attacking one country after another.
Yeah. And as Europe freaks out about the security guarantees, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's a definition. All right. So what is your basic thesis to the left that we're trying to address here with this article?
Yeah. The basic point is quite simple. And honestly, if you open your eyes and look at what's happening in the news, it should be pretty clear. If you ask, honestly, most people on the street, what's creating chaos in the world today, most people are probably going to say Donald Trump and or the United States, it's very kind of clear. But it's not clear to the left. The left still sees things that it's a multi-sided conflict, when really there's one main camp that's really the one that's on the offensive. And that's the United States, that's desperately trying to secure its position as a global hegemon. Now, I'm sure we'll get to go more into some of the specific kind of cases like China and Russia and so on, but that's the basic kind of thesis.
Yeah. Look, I partly want to play a bit of a contrarian role in this discussion just to kind of tease out some of the points a little bit more. My one question is, does an imperialist country always have to be on the offensive for it to be imperialist?
No.
Like, why can't? Because I can imagine somebody being like, okay, fine, it is right now, but one, so what? Like somebody else, some other country could be. Second, I imagine, like, from a non-Western point of view, or Eastern European, like in Ukraine, you have Russia attacking you. They're like, what are you talking about? No, it's Russia causing chaos. So how would you, like, I guess I'm trying to probe this point about who's causing the chaos.
Yeah.
Like, what's the...
Yeah, you're right. I think that's a good point. Like, it's not to point to the United States causing more chaos than other countries is not a sufficient argument to prove our thesis.
Mm-hmm.
So to really prove like that the U.S. empire is the sole real like imperialist power, we have to get into some of the more concrete dynamics. I think the first thing to show is that like an empire doesn't just die away peacefully. Like it doesn't just gradually leave the scene. What the current moment shows is that an empire will fight to defend its position.
Mm-hmm.
And this, for us, is really what we're seeing right now. And so the idea that there's this kind of rival Chinese empire and Russian empire that was able to establish itself entirely peacefully, basically, within the world that was dominated by the United States is really a pacifist, kind of gradualist conception of history. Mm-hmm. That you can just seamlessly move into a unipolar, into a multipolar world without kind of any kind of decisive rupture or conflict. Mm-hmm. That's a bit of a general point. Now, if we go into the Russian case, which I think is one of the more complicated ones, because, if you just look at it kind of superficially, it is Russian troops that are occupying big parts of Ukraine. It's not the other way around. But I think, a lot of the commentary and of the left, they just really focus on what happened when Russia kind of invaded Ukraine. But you have to look back, really. Like, what's the general trend in Eastern Europe since the fall of the Soviet Union? And the trend since the fall of the Soviet Union is clearly one of American expansionism. They've been extending NATO more and more all the way to the Russian borders. And, the whole crisis in Ukraine really starts, well, in 2014. Actually, it starts even before, when Ukraine still first made its demand to get into NATO. But let's say it becomes really acute in 2014, where the US and the EU really fostered a coup in Ukraine to get rid of Russian influence. And so if you look at this conflict, it's not one of like creeping, expanding Russian influence, but it's one of expanding American and European influence that are encroaching on the kind of historic grounds of Russia, until Russia kind of responded and said, enough is enough. We're going to, stand up to this and try to roll back this extension.
So how would the other camp see it? The left that sees this as a world as defined by inter-imperialism?
Yeah.
How do they view this question?
Well, they have to view Russia as an expanding imperialist power. Mm-hmm. But as I kind of said, I think that's kind of contrary to the whole development of how things have actually been playing out in the last couple decades. Mm-hmm. And even if you look at it on the economic level, Russia has a powerful economy. It certainly has a very powerful military, but it's not like it's lacking, has a surplus of capital that it's trying desperately to export outside of its borders. Actually, Russia has, I would guess, has more of a shortage of capital, and is trying to kind of catch up. So I think there is just not imperialist dynamics that we're seeing within Russia. That's not to say they don't nationally oppress people within their own borders. That doesn't say that if they win in Ukraine, that will nationally oppress Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. But it's just not a dynamic of expanding finance capital that's really at the root of this conflict on the Russian side.
Okay. Yeah, I think I appreciate you touching on the fact that what I said in my intro, like, these are not just because a country's not imperialist doesn't like mean it doesn't do terrible things.
Exactly.
But I think a lot of the liberal influences that have seeped into the left over the last 30 years is precisely that. Look at how oppressive it is. Or, for example, look at its allies, etc. That it just makes something imperialist. I know, for example, in doing some of the work on Iran recently, a lot of the Iranian progressives who hate the regime also hate Russia and call Russia and China both imperialist. Why? Because they kind of, back Iran. That doesn't really help. Okay. The other thing I also appreciated is now maybe we can develop this a little bit more in the course of the discussion, is the whole pacifist worldview, that at what point did quantity turn into quality when it comes to China becoming imperialist, because according to the materialist Marxist explanation of imperialism, wars are integral to that, So how can you just have a peaceful development of another imperialist power without revising the fundamentals of Marxism? And maybe, people think we're sect or dogmatic or whatever, but what would you say to those claims? That's just you being, I don't know, the 21st century is different or something.
Well, listen, you can make that argument. You can try to explain, but you have to try to explain it according to the laws of Marxism, how this would have been possible. Mm-hmm. But I think beyond even the kind of theoretical side of the question, like how is it possible for new imperialist powers to emerge without having had to make any wars, which I do think is a pretty like kind of fundamental point. Mm-hmm. Like then there's the question of like actually looking at world dynamics, so there's the theoretical side of like, but then you have to look at how world politics are playing out concretely. Mm-hmm. And does it kind of confirm one view or not? That brings us back to, what the role the United States is playing right now. Mm. That certainly like really confirms our view. Yeah. In our opinion.
Yeah, one of the things we've been pushing ever since this year started, I feel like things have escalated kind of sharply, Venezuela, Iran, etc. But one of the things we've been pushing alongside that is calling on China to actually defend Venezuela, to resist the U.S. What's actually happening out there is China's not doing that. So would it be correct to say that if China was, an imperialist power wanting to go on the offensive and, take advantage of the whatever hatred for the U.S. right now, it would be more willing to do so? Or is that too simplified?
No, but to me, that's a real question for people that think that China's imperialist, is to try to explain China's actions right now. Like Venezuela is one of their main partners in Latin America. Mm-hmm. The United States went, kidnapped the leader there, and stopped all oil shipments to China. China had invested billions in Venezuela, mm-hmm. and they did absolutely nothing to protest against that. Yeah. Iran, what has China done to materially really like support Iran? Mm. If Iran's a key node in the Chinese empire, like why aren't they doing anything? And
why not?
Well, because they're not an imperialist power. They're acting like a conservative Stalinist bureaucracy. Mm-hmm. Now, I think it's probably too much to get into the whole kind of is China capitalist or not for this thing. But if you just look at how they act, right, like it's really they really follow the rules of a Stalinist bureaucracy that is trying to just build socialism, like what they call Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics within China. So their priority is what? Self-sufficiency. And they want to kind of, protect themselves and stand up to the United States, but they also don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to try to defeat the U.S. empire. That's not really what's driving them. It's really a drive of like self-preservation, self-reliance, and they've been actually quite resistant to building a formal alliance with Russia and Iran and honestly anybody else.
Correct. Yeah, and I'm just reminded in the concrete cases of actually coming to the aids of country, really physically into the gun. I remember when I did this episode, I believe it was with Ray Bishop some time ago on Venezuela and China. We talked about that for a second. And I think a Chinese tanker was in the middle of the Atlantic at that point and they turned around.
Yeah.
Instead of going to Venezuela, etc.
Let me give maybe also a historical example, a comparison. Let's compare China has a huge economic weight right now in the world. Honestly, I'm pretty sure it's far superior to that of rising imperialist powers of the 20th century, like Japan, Germany, and even probably for a certain period of the United States, in terms of like the actual economic weight that they represented. But then if you compare how they're acting politically, it's really very different. Like Japan followed an extremely aggressive rise as an imperialist power, attacking Korea, having a war with Russia, invading China, and then just exploding and attacking every country in the Pacific. Like this was not like a gradual peaceful rise. Germany, to be able to establish itself first as the dominant power in Europe, it had to win 3 wars. And then, it had colonies, small ones, but it had colonies in Africa, committed terrible crimes, Namibia and so on. And even the US, which is traditionally if you want to look for any kind of peaceful rise of imperialism, like the US is the least aggressive if you want, until the First World War. But still, it had a war with the Spanish. It took over the Philippines, the Caribbeans. Like it was not like
still has colonies.
It still had colonies, It wasn't like a peaceful rise either.
Have colonies,
yeah,
Puerto Rico.
Right. So, but like, here's a question: like, where is the Chinese empire? I'm yet to find somebody that can actually answer this question. If China's an empire, where is its kind of exclusive zone of influence, which is the character of any kind of empire, that it dominates a certain zone through force?
Mm-hmm.
What area of the world is that for China?
Yeah. Sorry, to continue with my contrarian thing. Because again, I'm thinking of possible rebuttals to what you're saying. So, okay, Britain, the sun never set of the British Empire, but I mean, Britain is still imperialist today. Germany, France, these are still imperialist countries. I mean, okay, Germany's kind of the dominant force in the EU. So I guess, how would you take up that? Like, okay, Britain still has its territories overseas, but it's a rotting, declining imperialist power, but it remains imperial. So I guess, must an imperialist country have territory that is under its influence?
I think that's another good question. But I think you can't understand Britain or Germany or France's role in the world separate from their relation to the United States.
Uh-huh.
Like none of those powers really have a truly independent kind of military industrial complex. Even France, which has the most independence, like it really can't do much, and its position in the world today is like has no relation to its actual real force, but it's really a product of its alignment and role it plays in the American empire. So,
do you want to elaborate? Like, I guess you're talking about the post-World War II setup and the whole military umbrella and all of that?
Yeah. Like but you can see it very well with the whole Ukraine war right now. It's like the Europeans, they're banging their chest and we're going to stand up to Russia. But the truth is everybody knows that they are totally impotent, that they cannot do anything really independently from the Americans. And the truth is, and it's going to show in the next coming years, is that they themselves don't agree on much, like...
You mean the European countries?
Yeah, like a lot of people kind of are talking about this rupture between Europe and America and so on. But what they really miss is like the only reason that Europe is united as a bloc is because the US has kind of established Pax Americana in Europe. Mm. But if the US were really to leave Europe, then you would see the continent fracturing in all these competing tiny parasitical imperialist powers.
Yeah, and I think that's That's another point we've made in terms of our understanding of the post-Soviet, but also like the post-World War II period a little bit. Like, what, I guess maybe just the post-Soviet, but like, why has there been stability? The absolute hegemony of the US following the collapse of the Soviet Union was a complete sort of peaceful situation. Yes, of course, there were wars, but nothing close to what we're seeing now in terms of the growing instability. And that, again, was, the guarantee of Pax Americana, what you, I think, in somewhat of a provocative way, have referred to as a kind of super imperialism, I think, in the past. Yeah.
It's like it's really like a cartel. I think that's the way to look at it. A cartel, so it's obviously a reactionary entity, but like when there's a monopoly of one gangster, there's less infighting between the smaller gangsters.
Yeah.
Now, and what we're seeing now is that the power of the top dog is starting to go down, and it's really starting to become more and more bloody to keep on to its spot.
Look, I know we're not going into China as character or whatever, but China being imperialist or not, I think you've done a fairly decent job laying out just in terms of like how you have to approach it in terms of its aims, its actions, and put all of that in the course of the evolution of world events. I think that's the methodological point. You do talk about Taiwan, because that we all know that U.S. imperialism has it out for China. That's its medium long term like foe. And Taiwan is one of those flashpoints that the U.S. ruling class is always banging on about in terms of we can't be in this war and that war because we have to concentrate everything for that, So what about Taiwan? Because that is, I think, a crucial question. And how does that fit into the whole framework of inter-imperialist rivalry?
Yeah, I think Taiwan's the one real example that people can point to being like, look, China has these expansionary imperialist designs. But I think the minute you start scratching the surface a little bit, like this whole thing falls apart. Like China is not like the Philippines to the United States. Taiwan is not, like the Philippines to the United States or Algeria to France. Like the Taiwanese government's official name is the Republic of China. Like historically, they've not considered themselves a distinct people or nation from China. And you really have to understand the conflict between Taiwan and the PRC, the People's Republic of China, as really the continuation of the civil war in China following the Second World War, where the army led by Mao basically crushed the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek, and they were forced to flee mainland China, and the last place they were able to take refuge was in Taiwan. And that's really the modern kind of statehood of Taiwan really comes as a product of this civil war, and by the fact that U.S. imperialism has really guaranteed Taiwan's security and made sure that the revolution in China was not extended all the way to Taiwan. And one of the points we make in the article is that, one of the things that shows very clearly that China's kind of the Communist Party in China's desire to take Taiwan has nothing to do with the so-called kind of capitalist imperialist expansionism, is that the CPC's policy towards Taiwan has not changed at all since Mao's time. Like they've always sought to have reunification with Taiwan. So it's not like a new imperialist policy. It's really kind of they really see it as the last step in the national unification of China, and putting an end to the century of humiliation, like to really reversing the consequences of the century of humiliation. They see it as like the final kind of puzzle piece.
Interesting. But how does the question of Taiwan fit into the inter-imperialist framework? I guess, are you saying that this is one more thing that you're refuting from the left, which uses the case of Taiwan to...
That's the case. I think a lot of people on the left very just superficially point to Taiwan and say, look, the CPC wants to take over Taiwan. It's an imperialist power. But what this really is just a total echo of all the imperialist propaganda about Taiwan, who doesn't actually explain the real nature and history of this conflict at all.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Look, I think we've covered some of the basics. Well, a little bit more than the basics in terms of the approach, the analysis, methodology, and actually like some of the, the point about pacifism as a huge current underlying this analysis. I guess I want to switch to the political implications of this analysis because I think that's where the rubber what's the phrase?
Rubber hits the road.
The rubber hits the road. Because why are we banging on about this? Why is it important? Because
yeah. No, that reminds me a bit of the debate we had with the IG, where
that was 2 years ago.
Grete was like, oh, you Spartacist, you have this document theory of the world. If you like you got the analysis wrong in one document, and that means that your whole program is wrong because of like a wrong document. But so he's talking about the post-Soviet period,
right,
and understanding that U.S. imperialism became hegemonic after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they think that this is just like a small analytical point, but that's such a crazy position.
But moreover, they think that because, we come from the same organization, so they had the same worldview as us, which we are refuting and saying that this was a problem, this was a complete betrayal, so they have an interest in defending that.
Sorry, I skipped a few steps in the psychodrama.
Yes, that's okay.
But the basic point is that it's such a crazy view to think that like understanding the principal dynamic of world politics is like a secondary point for Marxists.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you don't, like we're materialists, so we base our program, what we do in the world, based on a understanding of material reality.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts like it goes down to like what to do in a strike and so on. But fundamentally, it has to be rooted in the most, general understanding of the major trends of world politics, and then kind of work itself down to the dynamics in certain countries, certain regions, certain cities. But it's really a unitary view of the world. And so if you don't get the basic dynamics of the world situation, like that doesn't mean that everything you do will necessarily be wrong, but you're starting from a fundamentally wrong strategic perspective. It's impossible to understand what needs to be done.
I just want to interject here. Trotsky in the Third International after Lenin makes this point in such a good and easy to understand way, like how every country can only make sense within the framework of the whole. And it is really a point about how Marxists need to approach their tasks and how to understand the world in which we live in order to intervene in it.
There is no question that's more important than really understanding the fundamental dynamics of world politics and how Marxists relate to this dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really also really a historic problem. So if you look back at the Trotskyist movement, since the Second World War, there's really been a problem in terms of understanding the significance of, the U.S.'s victory in the Second World War and what kind of implications that had for world politics. And that's for sure true as well in the post-Soviet period. In our tendency, we thought that the fall of the Soviet Union would lead to the rise of inter-imperialist conflicts between Europe and Japan and the U.S., which is absolutely not what happened.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of other political trends thought that we now lived in a kind of post-military world, or where now there's all this gobbledygook about the international corporations. States are now irrelevant,
right,
and now it's all international corporations and the internet.
2010s academia.
So then all this more recently, it's all this multipolar stuff that's creeping up. That like, oh, now the world is defined by all these.
Yeah.
But what's really been the common mistake, consistent and common mistake, is not understanding that the Second World War, a gigantic, like bloody conflict, established the U.S. empire, and that this is a global empire. and that this empire has to this day not been destroyed and is still really the dominant force that underpins economic and political relations in the world. And the kind of political conclusion of that is that kind of the central unifying strategic task of revolutionaries is to fight against this empire. As it established itself, and now today as it's really in decline, and really you see it every single day looking at the news as it's dragging the world down into a cycle of barbarism.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you laying that out. I just want to touch a little bit on the current problem, for instance, in the left. You've touched already on how in the post-Soviet period, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were our organization was disoriented, not knowing exactly what was happening. And granted, okay, whatever, hard to tell in the moment. There was lots of pressure, but the political implication of that was the failure to see that the Marxist movement has to fight to break the working class from liberalism as a dominant ideology through which the ruling class exerts its own class interest and cripples and chokes the movement of the oppressed and the working class. And so I think the left, I've said this a number of times in the show, but everybody talks about liberalism and this and that and the other thing today and how it's dead and we're dying or whatever, but they have not seen that the task was to break from it, but see it or not. But the point is, I think that they are still imbibing so much liberalism, and that includes in terms of their analysis.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. I want to ask the question, your last subhead here, it says, fight the U.S. empire, unify the workers' movement. What, can you elaborate on how this is the key to building the unity? Because, ultimately, to fight the U.S. empire, we need to build a strong anti-U.S. movement internationally. So how does this link to the question of unifying the movement?
I already touched on it a little bit, but I'll try to explain a bit more concretely. It is actually quite a concrete question. What is it that unifies the interests of a American worker, German worker, an oppressed person in Africa, somebody in Palestine, a worker in China? What is it that unifies their struggles in the current era? And really, if you look at it and if you look at it quite concretely in terms of what's happening in the world, American workers are being attacked by their own ruling class. So they have an interest to fight against U.S. imperialism in that way. British or German workers, their countries are tied to the hip to the United States, and these countries are being hollowed out and are paying for the price for being aligned and kind of a junior partner to the U.S.
In Germany, it's quite graphic with the Ukraine war, energy costs. There's auto being crippled. In Britain, I mean, we're on the verge of being dragged into the U.S.'s war. They're using the bases, all of this.
And since the thing to understand is the ruling class in Germany and Britain, of course, they oppress the workers in their own country. But you have to understand that those ruling class are themselves really intertwined, and you can't separate them from the American ruling class. And so the fight against the British or the German ruling class, an important component of that is to fight against the U.S. empire. You can't divide those two struggles. It's part of the same thing. Now, if you look at Palestine, I think it's quite obvious. The U.S. is the main support for Israel.
Yeah.
And obviously, to defeat Israel, you ultimately have to defeat the United States. So obviously, that's another link. And then China is really being, the U.S. wants to try to strangle China. And the bureaucracy in, CPC bureaucracy, which of course oppresses Chinese workers, its whole perspective is to basically conciliate the U.S. and to defend its own bureaucratic privilege and not try to really extend the revolution internationally, which is really the only way for Chinese workers, for the conditions to really improve, is to try to really, advance the revolutionary struggle internationally. And also, of course, resist U.S. imperialism's moves, because like Stalin before. Like all of his conciliations of imperialism only made conditions worse for the Soviet Union. And so when Hitler finally attacked the Soviet Union, they were in a much worse position than they could have been had the Soviet Union followed a revolutionary policy.
Yeah. I think the other thing about the Stalinist bureaucracy in the Soviet Union was also that the way it conducted itself, made a number of countries in Eastern Europe, Afghanistan, see the Soviet Union as an imperialist power itself. Again, very wrong. Some of the left actually bought on to that as well. Like, oh, they're invading a country that's imperialist. Oh, they're, really repressive in Poland, which they were, and that makes them crap. But what you see today is China doing similar things. For example, how it conducts its foreign policy in Africa, how it tries to develop parts of Africa,
And, one of the main arguments against our position is that this would mean support to Putin or to the CPC. But actually, it's quite the contrary. That argument is not totally unfounded, in that a lot of people who kind of focus on the United States in the left that are proponents of this multipolar world view, they tend to support actually the policies of Putin and Xi and so on. Of course, that's not our position, but precisely we understand that these countries and the leaderships in these countries, by being non-revolutionary, totally betray the anti-imperialist struggle. And totally and the fact that they lean on the oppression of their own people totally undermines their ability to resist the U.S. and, of course, develop and advance the condition of their own people.
Mm-hmm.
So our position does not in any way imply a political support.
Yeah, in fact, I think just in distinction to all of not just the left, but even a lot of the majority of the mainstream analysis right now on the war. They think the IRGC is doing great and the US made a huge miscalculation because they don't have a clear-cut strategy, whatever. And I think, our recent article about don't underestimate US imperialism actually makes precisely that point, that you cannot put the fight against US imperialism, you cannot just uncritically rely on the IRGC that, it's going to get the job done, and actually how you've seen what its whole strategy is doing is actually driving a huge swath of the Iranian population away from it,
But I think that if you kind of look at it concretely, you can see how really there's the working class and the oppressed internationally really have a common interest in fighting U.S. imperialism and where it's bringing the world. And that really is really the dynamic on which the revolutionary movement itself has to lean on to unify the revolutionary forces. Like, it really needs to unify on what is really an objective process, an objective dynamic. And very often the left tends to really dismiss or not give enough attention to how do we concretely forge political unity among the working class, when on the surface there seems to be kind of real fundamental fissures and conflicts.
Yeah, not just on the surface. I think it's pretty deep.
Yeah, right.
Right. Okay. Look, we're gonna go and argue these views at this conference. We are going to be at this conference in May. But I think in terms of pursuing this question in the left, what would you say is a task? Like, how do you begin to clarify these questions?
Yeah. Well, I think obviously debate, we have to put forward our views, we have to argue them. But I think what's also important is to really just keep making the link between the arguments and what's happening concretely in the world. Because that's the best argument, is to just look, as I said at the start, like just look out the window and read the newspapers. At the end of the day, it's the actual course of events that's confirming this dynamic. If we pose another way around, like if something totally different happens towards what we predict, then maybe we'll have to look back at our arguments and how we approach things.
Yeah.
But so far, I feel like the basic dynamic which we've laid out at our last international conference has really been confirmed, I think, by what's happened.
Okay. Well, yeah. Is there anything you wanted to add to sum up?
No, I think that's I think we've covered most of the points.
I guess I'll just conclude with, I'm looking at the article, but really, why are we insisting on this? As I started out, this is not just an analytical and an economic question, but has real programmatic implications. And the task, as we go into a more unstable, uncertain period, is to build a struggle against the US. And you end your article by saying we need to build an internationalist proletarian pull against the downward spiral in which US imperialism is dragging the whole world. And that's really the question. Like, how will this fight play out? Will, through all the different conciliation mistakes, etc., will it help the US, continue on its course? Or will the left be able to actually get its stuff together?
Yeah.
And clarify these questions, which are absolutely, I think, urgent questions in order to build the movement, start to lay the basis for unity in the proletariat.
Yeah.
International.
If I can just finish on this, it's kind of a basic question, but it's really, I think, the most important, most distinctive contribution we have to make to the international left is really the understanding of our central task being to offer a working class alternative to in the fight against U.S. imperialism in decay.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is basically really the core thing the ICL stands on, and really roots its fundamental perspectives on really every other question.
I could be, as a leftist, say, yeah, me too. Like, same with us.
Oh,
well, I guess maybe.
Ask. Who?
Well, I don't know. I guess if you put it so generally, like, yeah, we want to fight U.S. imperialism. Like, I think today, especially like with the last number of months, I'm sure that that's not super controversial. Or am I just kind of missing a point?
Most groups either will disagree on the first part, which is that they do not see it as U.S. They won't see it as a U.S. imperialism being the fundamental thing, but they see inter-imperialist rivalries. So you have to oppose China and Russia just as much as the U.S. Right. And then the other element is the proletarian side of it, which is, maybe some people will say they're trying to put forward a working class answer, but in reality, what they're doing is pretty much uncritically supporting like all kinds of various bourgeois solutions to this problem. Mm-hmm. And I think there's actually it's not actually so common, I think, that to even pose the tasks in a general way as I've done now. Although on the face of it, it seems, yes, perfectly obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Okay. On that note, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for explaining these things. We did a 2-part series, I think a couple of years ago now. It's on our YouTube. It's not a Smart Talk thing, but where Vincent lays out the class character of China and why it's not capitalist and why it's not imperialist. I'll link those in the show notes and the relevant articles laying out some of this stuff in more detail. And I think it would be nice to pick up on this theme sometime in the future in a little bit more depth.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you don't know, but there are just a few of oligarchs and capitalists profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep, and your vote, it ain't gonna stop them.